Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am joined again with Trini, and we're going to go through Colin's video on the Gospel of Matthew. Ijaz?
Yes, assalamu alaikum to everyone. I am actually excited for this one. I'm excited for all these videos. So make sure you subscribe and you follow Brother Farid's channel. I know he has a lot of beneficial content. Sometimes, alhamdulillah, sometimes he has a joke. It's always all the time. May Allah reward him.
Habibi,
Ameen.
barakallah feek. Folks, follow Ijaz. Oh, not here. Right here. Right here on Twitter. Lots of good stuff, inshallah. On his feed. So you won't want to miss that.
I
Let's
only say nice things about you on my feed. So
Habibi. All right, man, let's get to work.
Bismillah, let's get the show on the road. All right.
This series on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. We're looking at Matthew's Gospel. And what we're going to do in this series is a survey of a lot of data relevant to these issues of authorship and dating. We'll draw some approximate conclusions, but I'm not going to tell you what to think. You can draw your own specific conclusions from the data that we look at, from your own research. We will present a summary at the end of each video where we sum up our major points from each one of the Gospels as we go through them. So you'll remember from our introduction to this series, if you have watched that, if not, I would highly encourage you to, because we're going to assume that you know some stuff from that video. But we talked in that video about the extremely high probability that the titles were assigned to the Gospels in the first century. Now, in the Hermeneia commentary series on Matthew, written by Ulrich Luz, he says, thus the Gospel was probably attributed to Matthew the Apostle earlier than 100 CE. That leaves little time for ascribing to the Apostle an originally anonymous book, or a book that came from an unknown Jewish Christian named Matthew. So Luz is a critical scholar, and so it's not just some sort of extreme right-wing evangelical scholars who are saying these types of things. They're critical.
So let's just pause here quickly. Scholars from across the board differ on this point, but I think Colin missed the point here. He's saying it was probably attributed that early to Matthew the Apostle. He's not saying conclusively that we know it was Matthew the Apostle that made the claim to authorship himself. It's a different claim, that, and then to say that scholars believe Matthew wrote it himself and gave himself the title as the author of the Gospel.
It's a good point.
Scholars as well. Drawing from Hengel's work, Douglas Moo and D.A. Carwood, in short, the argument that Matthew was understood to be the author of the first Gospel long before Papias wrote his difficult words, affirming such a connection seems very strong, even if not unassailable. Next, Leon Morris points us to the oldest manuscripts with the title page preserved that do attest, and unanimously so, to Matthean authorship. Now, none of the oldest manuscripts of this gospel has been preserved with the title page intact, but from the earliest ones that do have it onward, the book is invariably ascribed to Matthew. This point is of greater weight than is usually recognized. We must face the fact that throughout antiquity it is accepted that Matthew wrote this gospel, and that there is no other name in the tradition.
So let's just pause here. He's actually made an error because one of the, actually not skip this part, I'll just continue.
So I wanted to take this time to pull up CSNTM for you. This is the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and their goal is to photograph in high resolution and post images of every page of every manuscript of the New Testament that we have, every Greek manuscript, and this is an incredible task for sure. But we're talking about title pages and so forth. So this is Codex Sinaiticus, and you can see what beautiful work this is. But the title page, here's the title page of Matthew, for example. So you go to the top, Kata Mathion. So it's not one of the oldest manuscripts. I'm just pulling it up as an example, and I'll put the link in a pinned comment for those of you who don't know about that. You actually want to go look at some old Greek manuscripts, you can do that. So what's the issue then? you know, the the attestation of Matthew as the gospel writer is unanimous in church history. It's from the earliest manuscripts we have that preserve the title page. It's always attributed to Matthew, right? So Matthew, Matthew, Matthew. So what's the
So that's wrong. So he's made the mistake in saying that all of the earliest manuscripts attest to Matthew, but the quote that he presented earlier said that none of the earliest have them. So it seems as if he's contradicting what the quote he appealed to a few seconds ago initially said. Now, to be clear, there are two early papyri or manuscripts that we need to take into consideration, and they are roughly contemporaneous with each other. One is P4, which he will mention later on, but there is the other called P1. Now, P1's date is roughly within the 3rd century CE, and it
Yeah.
does not contain the title for the Gospel of Matthew. In fact,
So
it's
it includes the first page, but it doesn't include the title.
correct. So P1 on the recto, the front, there's only one letter visible, which is the letter alpha. And on the verse, or the opposite, the back side of it, we do see that a title was added later on, but that is non-consequential to the point that we were making now generally.
Okay.
the question about authorship? Well, some of that stems from a quotation by Papias. Papias says, "So then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew or Aramaic language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able." Now, Papias' words come to us from Eusebius, and the difficulty with this quote is that every single word, just about, is ambiguous. What are the oracles? Is this Hebrew or Aramaic? Is this the actual language? Or is this the style? Does it refer to some sort of a Semitic style? That is, writing in Greek using Semitisms. What does interpreted mean? Does it mean interpreted from another language or from another literary style? So let's kind of take these one by one, and we will present some differing opinions for sure as we go through this. But let's first address the issue of the language Matthew's Gospel was originally written in. Carson and Moose say the mix of text forms in Matthew's Gospel suggests writing in Greek, but with knowledge of Semitic languages. There are detailed verbal connections in Greek between Matthew and Mark, and Matthew does not read like a translation from a Semitic language to Greek. So you can see how Papias' words are, a bit difficult. How are we to understand this? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but with respect to Matthew, Papias clearly attests to Matthean authorship. R.T. France notes, patristic tradition is unanimous that the author was Matthew, and no other Matthew is suggested than the disciple of that name whose call is described in Matthew 9, verse 9.
So just quickly, in our previous video, we pointed out that these attestations are generally later within the 2nd century, more than 100 years after Christ lived, and about 50 to 70 years after the Gospel of Matthew is assumed to have been written in some form. So Colin's point here does not really present itself as an evidence.
I would like to discuss the slide where he mentions Papias saying that this is in Hebrew.
Sure, you want to go back?
Or yeah, please. Or
Yes.
is that going to come up later? Is that going to come up later?
I don't think so.
Okay.
There we go.
I think this is extremely important. Isn't this like huge?
Well, let me list the problems with this, right? You will notice that he said that almost every word here is problematic.
Yeah.
There's good reason for that. So when it says Hebrew in the Hebrew or the Aramaic language, that is because the quote in Greek says the language of the Hebrews. Now, the language of the Hebrews can genuinely mean either Aramaic, Hebrew, or even possibly Greek, because they were speaking Greek at this point in time. But the way the scholars traditionally have understood this within the early church is that it refers to either Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, here is the problem, Brother Farid, and you can probably comment on this. If you don't know the language that he wrote it in, how can you be sure for certain you know about the person who wrote it? If you know the person, then you must know what language they wrote it in. It's a bit like, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying that the Prophet, he recited the Quran in the language of the Arabs. and then someone comes up and asks, well, which language of the Arabs? Some of them used Nabatean, some of them used Syriac, right? And, and then he adds, well, it could have been Arabic as well. Well, that's the problem. For us, we don't have that problem. For them, they do. So how can you know the author with certainty, but you don't know what language the author wrote in? And the language that you presume he wrote in, Hebrew or Aramaic, is not attested to in a single manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew. I also
Um,
want to point out here, forgive me, Brother Fareed,
yeah, yeah, go on.
I just want to point out one more thing here. You will notice that if Matthew did write it in Hebrew, there is a problem, because the information that Matthew takes, or the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew takes from the Gospel of Mark almost word for word, there is a problem called the lack of Aramaisms. So in the Gospel of Mark, you have these Aramaic sayings of Jesus, and those same stories using the same words in the Gospel of Matthew. The author of the Gospel of Matthew omits those Aramaic sayings. In fact, he even fails to translate them most of the time. So if he was writing, if this individual was writing to Hebrews, you would think he would leave that in. The fact that he takes it out goes to tell us probably he's writing to a primarily Greek audience at that time, who would not understand Aramaic, or who would not find the need to understand Aramaic or Hebrew in the first place.
Understood. Barakallah fiqh. One thing that came to mind when reading this quote, it doesn't seem like Papias, right, is
Mhm.
saying this. Okay. It doesn't seem like he's unsure. It seems like he's quite certain that this was in the language of the Hebrews, or in the language of the Jews, or
Yeah, he's
whoever.
undisputed on this point.
Yes.
Yes,
So since he's saying that, what came to mind was this book is not
in
the book
Hebrew.
of Matthew.
No.
That's simply it.
So the way that the scholars that Colin quotes reason this out is that they say that it could have been written in Hebrew and Greek, or they say generally Papias was wrong at this point. Now, if
Okay.
Papias is wrong,
Mm,
why is Colin appealing to him in the first place?
hello. I like that. I like that. He shouldn't be appealing to Papias,
No,
first of all.
no.
Um, so what I got from this is there may have been a Gospel of Matthew,
In
but if
Hebrew,
it was there, it was in Hebrew. It wasn't in Greek, and
exactly.
that's it. That's it.
But Brother Fluid, I have a question to ask you, right?
What's up?
When a narrator transmits some information and he's explicit on one thing, but that contradicts all the available evidence from all the other narrators and all the manuscripts, what does that tell us about that individual?
It depends on the level of mistake. If the mistake, or if the narration, if it's too big of a mistake, a narrator can just be like seriously tossed out in terms of reliability. However, if it's passable, if it's not that big of a deal, they might regard him as, it depends on how big the narrator is. It depends on how much he's narrated. So there's a formula there. There's a formula there. So if a narrator narrated 50,000 hadiths, and he has, like, a few mistakes here and there, whatever, like, it's not seen as a big deal. So it depends on the level of the mistake. This saying that, having the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew in front of you, and being like, is this Hebrew? And that being a mistake, that wouldn't fly. I don't
Mm.
think that would fly. I don't think that could be shrugged away.
Now, one of the problems here as well is that Christians like Colin, who tend to argue that Papias got this information fairly very early within the first century, here is the problem. Why does he never actually mention a Greek form to Matthew? If he met all of these people who would have known the eyewitnesses and the Gospels would have been circulating at that time,
Yeah.
then why would he omit that one core piece of information? It seems strange that that would be the one thing he omits against all the evidence which has survived.
Right.
Shall we
Let's carry
continue?
on, man. We got a lot of stuff to go through.
Yeah, I have to jump forward to see where we were last time.
I'm I'm ready for this one. I got a lot of Lebanon with me.
You sound too ready. I'm actually afraid. You might take my job now. I might have to block you on Twitter. Who knows? Let's get the show on the road.
Text forms in Matthew's Gospel suggest writing in Greek, but with knowledge of Semitic languages. There are detailed verbal connections in Greek between Matthew and Mark, and Matthew does not read like a translation from a Semitic language to Greek. So you can see how Papias' words are, a bit difficult. How are we to understand this? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but with respect to Matthew, Papias clearly attests to Matthean authorship, and R.T. France notes, patristic tradition is unanimous that the author was Matthew, and no other Matthew is suggested than the disciple of that name whose call is described in Matthew 9, verse 9. The Church Fathers are unanimous as well. Carson and Moo say, without exception, they, the Church Fathers, held that the Apostle Matthew wrote canonical Matthew and that it was first written in Semitic. That is true, for instance, of Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, and Jerome.
Just pause here quickly. Are any of these people from the 1st century? No.
Okay.
Are any of these people contemporaneous to Papias? No. Almost all of these people, beginning with Irenaeus and Tertullian, are writing in the late 2nd century. Eusebius and Jerome are in the 4th century. So you would see that he's taken people centuries, possibly later, to qualify a statement which is, as he said, difficult and ambiguous.
Right, and you've already refuted the point that it was first written in Semitic.
Yes.
So
good, that's cool.
Now, is that something that's agreed upon today?
It's universally agreed by almost every major scholar that Matthew was not composed in Hebrew, at least the version that we have today.
Right. Okay. Just carry on.
Authorship of Matthew comes up, and this quote from Papias comes up, and that gets dragged into the picture. So now you're talking about the language that Matthew was originally written in. Do you want to say, okay, it was written in Semitic language, or is written in Greek with Semitic style, or do you want to say Papias was wrong that it was written in Semitic, some other Hebrew writing, but he was right about Matthean authorship, right? So you can see how these two issues can kind of become entangled, but they don't necessarily have to be.
It's an issue, Colin.
Carson and Moo are
not just a minor issue, a major issue. He just brushes it aside.
Don't worry. Colin's got some quotes from contemporary scholars that will make you feel satisfied.
Papias referring to a Semitic language, and they say, in short, the evidence leads to a difficult conclusion. We are gently nudged to the conclusion that Papias was wrong when he claimed that Matthew was first written in Aramaic. Now, how could Papias have been wrong about this? Well, they suggest a couple of options. It was a natural conclusion since Jesus' ministry was among the Hebrews. Papias had little knowledge of the popularity of Greek in first century Palestine, or he was confused with other Hebrew writings in circulation.
Brother Fareed, do we need to say anything here? Because this affirms everything that we've been saying all along. Would that not be the case?
Yeah.
No,
I think that just the simplest thing is, it's hard. It's hard for them to accept this. It's hard for them to accept that. Now, Papias is the earliest person to comment on this, right?
Yes.
Did he screw up any of the other languages?
Not to my knowledge, but his claim about the Gospel of Mark is also incorrect as well.
What was that again?
He said that the Gospel of Mark was written in an unordered fashion, but the Gospel of Mark as we have it today is exactly as we find it in Matthew and Luke. The only Gospel that's different in terms of its timeline is the Gospel of John.
Okay.
I want to point out here.
Is it possible that Mark had like an original order that was different than from what we have today?
It is difficult to know because the only version that has come down to us is affirmed by the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. So because they generally agree, it would be difficult to say that it was unordered or disordered. That does not seem to be the case from the manuscripts that we have today.
But what would cause you? Sure, I agree with you. I
understand
completely. What would cause someone to make a mistake like that?
Here is the problem here. uh, in the first and second century, the way that people would hear the Gospels, they would gather together and then people would read them out loud because most people back then could not read. Today
Okay.
as well, it seems to be the case. But the point is, they would hear it orally in a large setting, meeting in a house, and someone recites it out loud. Now, it is very difficult, I'm going to be honest, to accept the idea that they were able to differentiate between the Gospels accurately, but Papias seems to be the only person and the earliest witness that seems to confuse them against almost everyone else in the later tradition. That can mean only one of two things. Either the tradition at the time of Papias was so confusing that it would be easy to confuse the identities behind the authorship, or perhaps it is the tradition had not developed to that point where one could be certain about what they were hearing, or that Papias was just wrong. All of
Uh,
those three things are bad regardless.
I was actually referring to the order, the matter of order. So you're saying they were orally transmitted, right? Or at least they were orally
When you
recited.
say the order, do you mean the order of the saints within the Gospel of Mark, like the
Yes.
chrono? Yeah, that's
Yes.
what I'm referring to. Yes.
Yes. So whoever would be reading out the Gospel of Mark, he would read it in different order, or in
No,
like
like the way it was composed
yeah,
itself, like a
yeah,
saying from chapter 7, maybe
yeah.
it was instead of chapter 1. That's just a hypothetical example.
Okay, okay, okay. So why couldn't be that that was the case um with the case with Mark's Gospel in general? Why can't we say that? And then it was reordered later on.
So we can't theorize that, but because we have no manuscripts
Yes,
which put
I
it in
I,
that way, yeah.
I understand. So it is a possibility because I mean, what would cause Papias to come to that conclusion? I mean, it's you see to mess up a language to say like to say something like I'm trying to think of some sort of Islamic equivalent of something like this. Um, so if someone was to say that Sahih Muslim didn't have chapter titles,
Mhm.
if we had a scholar from the third century or fourth century who said that, and of course the manuscript tradition today, most, if not all of it, includes titles, then of course that would be like confusing, and would be
Yes.
like, did this guy screw it up? Of course, today it's mainly accepted that the chapter titles were added. I think in the seventh, sixth century, or something like that. Of course, after Hijrah. So I'm saying that statements like that, early statements like that, just because they're strange doesn't mean they're necessarily false. This guy was high on something, or he messed up, screwed up. He screwed up Greek and Hebrew. They write so the writing is so similar. It's so weird. I mean, dismissing a thing like that, I can understand why you I can understand why you would want to dismiss something like that because it
Mhm.
goes against your narrative. However, and then you rely on him as your earliest source for this information. Do excuse the rant. Do excuse the rant.
It is problematic. I do want to point out here, it's very strange what he writes. He had little knowledge of the popularity of Greek in first century Palestine.
Mm.
Do you know why this is strange? It is
What is it?
because Richard
Why?
Walker,
What's that?
inshallah.
What's the point? What's the point of saying that?
Well, I'll tell you why. So, where Pierre was located was in modern day Turkey today. It's a
Yeah.
city called Hierapolis, which is midway between what you can roughly say Rome and Jerusalem. So anyone going from Jerusalem to Rome to meet the apostolic members of the church in Rome, that's the city that they would have to pass through, which is
Okay.
why he was able to collect so many sayings. It's as if there was a road between Mecca and Medina, and he was like in the dead center of it. The companions or the companions of the companions going back and forth, you can wait and hear information from them. That's the
I, I,
equivalent.
I mean, what's the point of mentioning this? Had little knowledge of the popularity of Greek in the first century. What?
Well, They're
What
trying
if,
to
yeah,
justify his fallibility here, give reasons for why he could be in error. But the reason I point out where he was from was because if he did live
yeah,
within the first century, and that's accepted, if he did live within the first century, it is almost impossible that he would have little knowledge of what the the language that they spoke of from the city that they came from. If he's
right.
stopping to ask them, hey, what do you know? Then he has to speak to them in a language that they understand.
Akhi, let's assume he didn't know. Let's assume he wasn't aware of the popularity. Let's assume he didn't know Greek. He still made the claim that it was in Hebrew.
Mhm. It's
Yeah,
problematic.
it is very problematic. Okay,
Alhamdulillah, I'm
so
not a Christian.
confused with other Hebrew writings in circulation. That's, I mean, that's, I think that's the best one, and the three possibilities. I think the best, I mean, the likeliest thing is, you know,
He was
Gospel
confused.
of Matthew was probably Hebrew. I don't know.
Probably. But Allahu Alam, let's move on,
Wallahu
inshallah.
alam. Let's carry on, man. Let's carry
Now,
on.
this is not the only option. Gundry offers a thorough analysis on this issue. In the Hebrew dialect, he's referring to Papias' words, a Hebrew dialect, then, does not imply that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic language. In other connections, we should expect the conjunction of Hebrew and dialect to form a linguistic reference. But the stylistic contrast between Mark and Matthew cancels such an expectation here. We have yet another option. All these passages suggest that the Greek version of Matthew was earlier translated back from Greek into Aramaic. This back translation was represented by Jewish Christians, however, as the original form of Matthew.
Okay. So I'm gonna be refuting this guy here. All right. It's likelier. It's likelier to have been the other way around. It's likelier to have been from Hebrew, or excuse me, from Aramaic into Greek. It's likelier for that to have happened. Or and bear with me, Colin, that the Gospel of Matthew was originally in Hebrew, and what you have today, this text that's really similar to Mark, is not the Gospel of Matthew.
I agree with your conclusions. The options that you offer him are charitable. Let me say that. Shall
Alhamdulillah.
shall we move on?
Please.
So, I want to present you with options here because you're going to run into people who will say, well, Matthew was written in Hebrew or Aramaic first, end of story. Well, no. How about there are really, really good reasons for believing that Matthew was written in Greek? We talked about some of those. Papias' quote, it's not an open and shut case. Okay, we have really good arguments for and against on either side. So I want to present you with different perspectives so that you can draw your own conclusion. I'm not going to tell you what to think on that particular issue for sure. I just want to present you with the evidence.
Let's go on.
Authorship. Okay, we've talked about what Papias said regarding the Hebrew or the Semitic dialect. What about authorship in general? For me, I mean, it could not be more secure. So let's look at some evidence for internal authorship first. From the characteristics of the gospel noted above, we may reasonably infer that its author was a Jewish Christian with an extensive knowledge of and a strong interest in the Old Testament, familiar with scribal traditions and with the methods of rabbinic debate, and capable of writing in good Greek, even though his own cultural background was clearly Semitic. Many of Jesus' early disciples, known to us and unknown, could fit this description, given the increasing recognition that Greek was widely used in first century Palestine, particularly in Galilee of the Gentiles. Undoubtedly, Matthew would be likely to fit the description, but is there any reason for seeing him as a more likely candidate than the others? France then summarizes the clues from internal evidence as follows. Fluent in Greek, this would make sense as a tax collector, and fluent in Aramaic as well. Literate, including possibly taking notes on Jesus' teaching. A record keeper, well educated, perhaps a self-portrait in Matthew 13:52, and then numerous references to tax collectors and financial affairs in the gospel, which would make.
So let's just pause here. None of those reasons are reason to definitively point to a person who would be Matthew, a tax collector. Remember, we spoke about this in the previous video. If you're writing in the voice of someone, which is what they did in the first century, they would, this is called ipsissimal vox, they could take on the identity of a person who does such a thing and write in their voice what they think that person would say. So would they be literate? Yeah. Would they know some Semitic traditions? Yes. Would they know the general geography of Palestine? Yes. None of those things allow us to filter it and say this is definitively a person known as Matthew the tax collector. All of these are nice inferences, but they're not proofs as to why Matthew was the author.
Now, I would say that is, yani, subhanAllah, it's a good breakdown. I'd like to add, if we found a manuscript of the reports of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and it said, قال Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam this, قال Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that, he said this, he said that, and the title page said, it was called Musnad Abi Bakr as-Siddiq. Okay, am I going to assume that this is? Excuse me. Um, it said Musnad Umar. Okay, excuse me. It says Musnad Umar. Why am I going to assume that this is Umar ibn Khattab? There were thousands of Umars. Why does it have to be someone from the first generation? Why can't it be someone from the second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh generation? Why does it have to be someone from the first generation? What's the evidence that this Umar is the most famous Umar ever? Okay, so let's say, there's mention of matters that Umar would have known. So what? There's mention of battle-related information, and Umar took parts in battles. Well, you had hundreds of thousands of people taking parts in battles. Yeah, subhanallah, man, this is really weak. And we're gonna get to some stuff in the Gospel of Matthew. I've done some of the prerequisite readings today and yesterday. That's gonna even prove that the attribution is even less likely than this. But
Yes.
please,
Let's continue. Bismillah.
please.
It makes sense if Matthew was a tax collector. Leon Morris lists some of these discussions of financial affairs and money. Matthew uses the general word for money, namisma, and the words for gold 5 times, silver 10 times, and talent 14 times, a total of 29, whereas Mark refers to silver once and Luke has it 4 times. They have none of the other words for big currency.
Brother Farid, he uses the word gold and silver. Aren't you convinced?
Oh wow. So what's the difference? What's the point between him and Luke? Luke was someone that wasn't he wasn't what was the word? The tax collector?
Yeah.
What was it?
Yeah, tax collector. No, Luke apparently was not a tax collector. But
Okay.
even if that were not the case, wouldn't the person paying the tax know what they were paying in?
Apparently Luke didn't.
This is an argument from silence, by the way. Just want to
Yeah.
point that out. Let us
It's quite bad. It's quite bad.
continue.
Of course, this would make sense if Matthew was a publican. As Jesus passed
Akhi.
on from there, he
Akhi.
saw a man.
Akhi, he doesn't believe this, man. He doesn't believe this.
He wants to believe it.
I don't think he does. He perhaps believes in the attribution of Matthew to Matthew. He doesn't believe in these arguments. There's no way anyone who Colin is to some degree well read. I don't believe that anyone's that gullible. Anyone who's that well read is that gullible. Sorry, Colin.
Well, unfortunately, reading does not make a man intelligent just by reading itself. There's this word in Greek, sophos moros. It's what you use for the English word sophomore. The literal meaning of that word, sophos, wise, moros, idiot, it generally means bookful, blockhead, ignorantly read. A person who reads but who does not understand what they read. So you can be well read. It does not mean you understand what you read.
Barakallah feekum. Learning some Greek fawaid from you today, man. It's good stuff.
Bismillah.
Called Matthew, sitting at a tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." he arose and followed him. Origin is relevant at this
That's
point
it, man.
among the four Gospels, which are the only
Settled.
That was it. You got to go back, man.
I
You
gotta
got to
go
go
back.
back,
Okay,
please.
right there we go.
This is it, man. This is it. This is it. This ends the discussion. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. That's exactly how I refer to myself when I'm telling a story.
Now, they did write in the first century, it is in some of the biographies, they did refer to themselves in third person. So we could technically give him a pass. But that does not mean, however, that the Matthew that is writing this is the same Matthew who sat at the tax booth, as you rightly pointed out. I do want to say here, if Matthew abandoned his job, it would seem as if there are no consequences that he did this. Like he randomly one day stopped collecting money. He randomly one day stopped accounting for the funds which he had collected. That seems to me like something the law would be troubled by. The Romans would not take to that too kindly, their taxes not being accounted for. So it does seem strange that the guy just gets up, abandons his post, and moves on. This does not seem realistic to me, to be honest.
I think what I'd like to point out is that he's not just speaking in the third person. He's saying a man called Matthew.
Yes.
This is too much, Yani. This is too much. This is too much. That you do this so that no one could ascribe this book to you. That's what I would do if I didn't want something to be ascribed to me. I would say, I would say that. Or most likely, the likely scenario is this was not written by me. I cannot imagine writing a story where I am included in it, and there's no indication at all from the beginning to the end that I am the narrator of this by saying I saw this and that, etc., etc. I heard him say. No indication that this is from an eyewitness source, and then using words like a man called Farid.
Maybe you should change your Twitter handle to a man called Farid and see what happens. Shall we move on, inshallah?
Yeah, let's move on. Okay, to be honest, this ends it for me. This ends it for me. Like to be honest, Akhi, this is too much. This is too much. And anything you say after this, any attempt to attribute it to Matthew, the taxpayer, you could attribute this to some other Matthew, but attributing it to the Matthew in this story makes absolutely no sense.
I agree with you. However, I just want to read. There's one point I need to get him back on. Let me see. Shall I skip forward and see if I find it?
Yeah.
Okay. So. Okay. Blah blah blah. He quotes Ignatius. That's useless. Useless. When does he do the manuscript part? Because I know what he's uncomfortable with.
Are we skipping forward or back?
Forward. Oh, okay. Did you want to do the rest of the video? Because you said you were done. I was confused.
No. Do the rest of the video.
Okay. I was like, okay, Farid's done. Okay.
No. I meant I'm done. When I said I'm done, I meant that I'm done in regards to this topic and what it means to me. I'm done. However, I'm not. He needs to know. Colin needs to know. And the Christians that are watching this need to know, and the Muslims need to know as well. And Christians, dear Christians that are watching this, we're not doing this because we hate you. We're not doing this because there's this malice. It's not bad. It's just pointing out to you guys that you're following something that is falsely attributed to a disciple of Jesus, and you're accepting it without being critical, and you should be critical because it's a big deal. It's not a small deal. We're in Islam. We're skeptical, not just with a hadith, with a single word. You'll find sometimes the Sahaba. You'll find Abdullah bin Umar critiquing a hadith, okay, because of the placement of the words, even though it has no effect. on the general meaning of the hadith. Subhanallah. So imagine accepting a whole book. So yeah, please carry on, man. I'm sorry.
SubhanAllah. The lengths that they go to. Let's see.
And that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican. So let's look at some more of what the church fathers have to say. Once again, the attestation to Matthean authorship is unanimous. Irenaeus of Lyon, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their dialect. We have very early attestation from Ignatius as well, who's writing in the 1st century or perhaps the early 2nd century.
Was this?
Hingel notes that.
What was? Oh, so the previous quote says that Matthew was in Hebrew. It's not just Papias.
What's his name? Irenaeus is relating the tradition. Not that he knows himself personally, because he's writing at 185. That is almost 80 years after Papias himself wrote. And I do not believe he quotes Papias at that point.
Okay, okay, please go back to that quote. I do apologize that this is taking too long, but man, this is really important. I'm learning this. I'm learning this as we're going along, and so it's and here's the thing: even if he was quoting Papias, he would correct this. He wouldn't let it slide.
No. Now, to be clear, we have manuscripts possibly from around this time, and they are of the Gospel of. Well, technically, they're of the Gospel of Matthew, and they're not in Hebrew or in Arabic. They're plainly in
because whatever that is, whatever that manuscript, whatever it is, it's not the original Gospel of Matthew.
No.
Gospel of Matthew is Hebrew, khalas, man. Let's carry on.
A very early attestation from Ignatius as well, who's writing in the 1st century or perhaps the early 2nd century at this point. Hingel notes this. Ignatius certainly knows the Gospel of Matthew. In a footnote, he lists some parallels, a very dense section by Ignatius, the Son of God, according to the will and power of God.
I want to point out here the reasoning that is employed here. So Ignatius, according to Colin, clearly knows who Matthew is, but he doesn't say in his own words that Matthew wrote a gospel. Rather, all Ignatius seems to be doing is sharing sayings in circulation at that point in time, which are common to today's version of the Gospel of Matthew. That does not mean, however, he identified this as being from the Gospel of Matthew.
Does he attribute these statements to the Gospel of Matthew?
Not to my knowledge, no. Corpus Ignatium is fairly later because the surviving manuscripts are beyond the 6th century, I believe. So it is difficult to say whether Ignatius himself definitely wrote this or if the contents of it mentions that Matthew was a tax collector that wrote a gospel. Okay. Yeah, it's complicated. But we have to, I'm trying to be as honest and as clever as I can, because there are just some nuances that we have to take into consideration with the statements that we make, especially when we comment on another religion.
Yes.
Born of a virgin, baptized by John, that all righteousness might be fulfilled by him. He's just quoting Matthew time and time again. Before we move on to the issue of dating, let's look at one final quote by Leon Morse. Matthew was not, as far as our information goes, especially prominent, either among the 12 or in the early church. Accordingly, there seems to be no reason for assigning to him such an important writing, unless, in fact, he wrote it.
Wrong. He's one of the 12 disciples. That's important enough.
Right.
So he may not have been as prominent, but guess what? He was one of the 12. That still, by definition, makes him important.
I'd like to comment on that. There's an actual companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him. I forgot his name, but basically, he had there were people that came a century or two later that attributed their lineage to him because he took part in the Battle of Badr, and we barely have any information about that companion. Barely any information, if anything, maybe a sentence. His whole biography is like a sentence. All we know is that he participated in the Battle of Badr. And due to that, you had people attributing their own lineage to him. Can you imagine that? So sometimes attributing something to someone who's not as famous allows you to get by.
It
Allows it,
does.
yeah.
Yes.
As
So
opposed to them, like if they were to say, "Oh, by the way, I'm from Beni Hashim." No, you're not, because everyone here is, or these people from Beni Hashim, they don't know who you are, right? And it was ironic because that specific companion, he didn't have any children. Yeah.
what's funny about the quote that he just presented is that, yeah, he may not have been as prominent, but as you rightly said, because he was not as prominent and there were no known works attributed to him, it makes him the easiest candidate, because once you eventually hear that he did write something, you have no reason to dispute it in the first place.
Okay.
It makes it easier to accept. So you're quite
Right.
correct, Brother Fareed.
Right.
Let's continue.
Very well said. Let's move on to the issue of date. That quote that we heard just a couple of minutes ago from Ignatius puts an upper limit on the writing of the Gospel of Matthew, quite obviously. There are certain presuppositions that go into dating the Gospels. Every scholar.
Let's just stop there. So now I have to get technical. One, Colin is wrong. Why? What he's referring to here as the upper limit is the terminus ante quem, or like by this point, everyone knows that this is when this document was written. Well, and this is who the author is. Well, no. Then Colin quotes Ignatius as saying that Matthew, the tax collector, who was a disciple, wrote it. No. So you can't use a non-attribution as a limit for something that you're inferring in the first place. This just seems like really complicated, ambiguous logic being applied here from my perspective. Shall I continue?
Please, yeah.
Did you understand that point, by the way?
Kind of lost me.
Okay, so I'll break it down this way.
Uh,
He's saying that we can know that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew because at this very early point, in possibly the early 2nd century, we have Ignatius quoting what is known today as the Gospel of Matthew.
yeah.
However, Ignatius himself does not say he's quoting from the
Yes.
Gospel according to Matthew. So
Yes.
this upper limit that he's created, the ceiling to say, yes, at this point, everyone has to know who wrote it, is in fact not proven, but rather assumed.
Right.
And so this upper limit, where does he get this upper limit from to infer that? It's nonsense. It's
Okay.
not evidenced based on anything. So I hope that clarifies.
Yes, it's clearer now. Thanks.
Sorry, it's just that when he uses the term upper limit, I know the technical term that he intends to use, but doesn't use it.
Okay.
Let's continue.
Or has them. Let's look at a couple. So the first one would be mark in priority, assuming that Mark's Gospel was written first. Okay, whatever date you put for Mark's Gospel, Matthew has to be after that. Okay, so that's an assumption. Another one would be apparent anachronisms. You're not going to run into this directly with Muslims, but indirectly, because any anachronism, so a big one in the Gospels would be the destruction of the temple. Anything that remotely refers to the destruction of the temple has to be after AD 70, because some scholars, of course, are going to have the presupposition against predictive prophecy, secular scholars, for example. So therefore, Matthew has to be after AD 70, and it couldn't be right after AD 70 because it would be a bigger subject in Matthew's Gospel. So it has to be, there has to be a buffer of time there. So Matthew's Gospel gets pushed later and later. Now, like I said, this is not something that you're going to run into directly with Muslims, but indirectly, because Muslims are going to read from secular scholars, namely one secular scholar, the only secular scholar
Barterman.
that they'll cite, and that's Aaron. So these scholars like that are going to smuggle in these sorts of presuppositions, and you're going to encounter them indirectly from Muslims.
Well, here's what. Let's remove that presupposition right now and see what happens. Go on a thought exercise with me, would you, Brother Fareed?
Let's do it.
He's saying to us that the Gospels, if they mention the destruction of the temple, then it has to be written after the year 70 when the temple was destroyed, so that
Yes.
the authors can make up a prophecy that Jesus 40 years earlier said that the temple would be destroyed.
Okay. Did he? Is it? Does it come in the
so
form?
in the Gospels, he does mention that no stone will be left from the temple.
Okay.
Obviously, we know that's not the case because the temple itself today, the Western Wall, is a part of the temple structure.
Okay.
right? So yeah, that contradicts that point. But let's remove that presupposition that Jesus did not make this prophecy, and that this could have been written before the year 70, and it was a prophecy. That's plausible, but not provable. On the other hand, what other Gnostic Gospels mention the destruction of the temple? In fact, I'm not aware that any of them, to my knowledge, mention the destruction of the temple in the year 70, yet we all know that they're written after the year 70. So
Mm.
his idea here does not work for him, because what that means is we can now remove that year 70 and we can put the gospels alongside the Gnostic gospels, which are generally seen as later rather than earlier. So Colin, you got what you wanted. We took out that presupposition, and it allows us to move it later rather than earlier using contemporaneous evidence.
Bismillah.
Third will be tensions between Jews and Christians, the way that's portrayed in Matthew's gospel. Some scholars say that reflects the sort of social circumstances around 85 AD. So that's going to push the gospel into that area. So these are all open to numerous criticisms. Scholars who would want to suggest an earlier date would cite things like Matthew's independence of Pauline writings. Matthew mentions the Sadducees 6 times, but these fell out of influence after AD 70. Matthew's preoccupation with Jerusalem, that would be a very odd fixture if Matthew was writing after AD 70. Matthew's phrasing of the flight from Jerusalem. Matthew's reference to a gift at the altar would be a very odd reference if the temple was destroyed. Matthew uses the present tense when Jesus describes the temple as a den of robbers. Woe to you, blind guides, who say if anyone swears by the temple. Once again, all of these temple references would be very odd if the temple was destroyed. Matthew's focus on Jewish persecution of the Christians.
So, just quickly here, none of these things are strange, because it was widely accepted then and even now, 2000 years later, that the temple is a very important thing for the Jews. And so it could be looked at as, yes, the destruction of the temple is God's judgment against the Jews, according to Christians, and that's what the church fathers did say. Therefore, it makes sense why the author to the gospel, attributed to the Gospel of Matthew, does include these references. It makes sense given the anti-Jewish perspectives that the early church held.
Personally, I have no issue with the prediction of the destruction of the temple.
Mm,
I'd let it slide. I wouldn't raise this objection against Christians.
I
Personally.
don't either, but when Christians use it in terms of the historical method to predict when the gospel could be written, then we do have to address them on that point.
Okay.
Although as Muslims, we believe in prophecy. Yeah. So I just mentioned all of the reasons he gives in this list here don't put it before the year 70. The temple is still mentioned by the Jews 2000 years later. So that they mentioned it even shortly 15 years thereafter does not make it an evidence that it was written before the year 70. Let's
Right.
continue.
So for some scholars, like Gundry, the question is not before or after 70 AD, but how long before 70 AD. Gundry says very clearly, how much earlier than AD 70 did Matthew write his gospel? Now, Gundry is one of those scholars who can sway the scholarly consensus, and he appears to attempt that here. Many recent sociological studies of Matthew are flawed by the unargued assumption that Matthew wrote after AD 70. Further such studies should reposition Matthew before AD 70. So where does this leave us with authorship and dating?
This is dalil, yani,
I
bro.
would suggest some things to keep in mind as we...
Say that again, Brother Floyd.
This is dalil. Gundry said this, and therefore, Gundry sways people, man. Therefore, we gotta accept that it's pre-70.
Well, you know what? Donald Trump sways people. I guess we should believe what he says as well. So shall we wrap up the video here, inshallah? Because he doesn't really say anything useful
There's not
thereafter.
much. How much is left?
About a minute and 30 seconds. Shall we
Let's
continue?
go for it, man. Let's
Okay.
go for it. Let's go for it.
Summarize our findings from this video. we do have internal evidence in the gospel that matches Matthew's description. It's highly unlikely that Matthew was originally written in Semitic. It's improbable that the gospel could have been renamed from another author and distributed so quickly. The book is universally ascribed to Matthew in ancient tradition. There is no indication that the gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title, and prior to AD 70 is most plausible. So some of you have already asked in the comments section if the attestation of history is so unanimous regarding the approximate date and the authorship of Matthew and Mark, Luke, John. How do scholars differ? Why would they differ on these issues? And we're going to talk more about that in the fourth video. That's something I've built into our discussion of the authorship and dating of John's Gospel. So I would ask you to hold on to that question, to those types of questions. But we're going to see that the methodology that some New Testament scholars apply to the New Testament is inconsistent with their peers and other branches of scholarship. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful in surveying the data relevant to the authorship and dating of Matthew. I'll see you next time in the series for Mark. Thanks for watching.
Okay, Brother Floyd, would you give me permission to just comment on a couple of things that he mentioned in the first video on this series?
Please go for it, man. Please go for it.
So on this screen, the second to last one, no indication that the gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title. Now, he made two videos before this. One was an introduction, and in this one, he does not use the information from the introduction, but he reads it into this video in the second to last point. So the second to last point says, no indication that the gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title. By this, I assume he means the attribution to the authorship of Matthew. So he seems to be arguing that, at least from his very first video, the introduction, that is the case. But we know that's not the case. Why? Papyrus 1, the very first one, cataloged here. P1 has no title for the Gospel of Matthew, and it is the title page. So that tells you, guess what? That there is an indication that it did circulate without an appropriate title. That is an attribution to authorship. Now, second to this, in his first video, he appealed to a manuscript called P4. Now, P4, the dating is very much disputed, but on that small fragment, it's called a flyleaf fragment, and he mentions that P4, according, I forget the scholar that he references, I think it's Hengel in 1985. He says that because it says Katamathion and it's early, it must mean that the gospel always circulated with this title.
Yeah.
Do you know what the problem is?
What? Katamathion is according to Matthew. Yeah.
Here's the problem. When this manuscript was discovered, it was discovered in the year 1890 by a person called Scheil, Scheil. Now, when he discovered it, the dating that he gave to that manuscript himself was the 3rd century CE, which, as you know, is contemporaneous with P1, which would mean that around that time, it both circulated with and without a title. But there's a problem here. Scholars over the years differed as to the dating of it. So some of them dated it in the late 2nd century, which would be about the year 175 onwards. Now, that would fall in line when we knew Irenaeus was writing, when Tertullian was writing, etc. But here's the problem. That early dating is not the only date. So the guy who discovered it himself gave it what year? 3rd century. Now, there is what we later found out was that this manuscript had fragments in other places that were purchased 10 years later in the year 1900. And these manuscripts, the writings in Matthew and Luke, don't match the writing from that fragment found in the year 1890. So we already know that it's later just by that point alone.
Okay.
Consequential to Colin's point here is that multiple scholars over the years, including Frederick Kenyon, Dr. Hunt, all place it within the 3rd and also open the possibility to the 4th century. Again, that falls in line with what the majority of scholarship has said. The titles came later not earlier. But that betrays the very last point, which is that the manuscripts themselves, they have a form of distinguishing between paragraphs known as stikoi. Now, initially, when the Gospels were written, they were written in one continuous line without spaces between them and without punctuation marks, continuous script. And so we know by necessity that as as more people became literate, more features to the text were added, like punctuation marks and spacings. So this definitively puts it later rather than earlier. So when he appealed to P4 and it says katamathion, and therefore it must be an early attestation, that actually betrays what scholarship is saying now and what the people who discovered it said back then, against what all the other scholars have said, which his source, Hengel, was quoting from. So I hope that provides some perspective on that matter. We, in fact,
Barakallah.
do not have a very early title for the gospel, according to
Jazakallah
Matthew.
khairan. Very interesting. He mentions that he speaks about the Markan, what was the
Priority.
priority, implying that Matthew copied, or excuse me, saw Mark as a source or took Mark as a source, and he dismissed that. He dismisses that in I believe 5 videos. He's got 5 videos on the subject. Um, I don't know what we're going to do with that. Are we going to
Well,
go through that?
well, it's
Yeah.
interesting because almost all of the scholars he quotes in the 3 videos that we've looked at, all of them believe in Markan priority. So he's
Wow.
fundamentally appealing to people, and he looks at them as an authority, yet disagrees with the conclusions that they come to. I just
Wow.
find that problematic.
Do you want to go through that, or would you like to just discuss this briefly now, since we're talking about Matthew?
So we can discuss it. What aspect of it would you like to discuss?
Well, so from what I'm aware, and do correct me if I'm wrong, 91% of the content of Mark can be found in Matthew. Is that correct?
Maybe a little less, I would say 80% probably,
Okay.
but scholars differ on that point. But it's
Okay.
definitely upwards of 80, yes.
Now, are those direct quotes?
Yes,
Or,
word for word copies.
well, there you go. So definitely someone's quoting someone else. It's either Mark taking from Matthew or Matthew taking from Mark.
Yes.
What comes to mind is Matthew taking from Mark is a huge problem because Mark is not even an eyewitness.
No.
Why would Matthew rely on someone who's not an eyewitness for matters that have to do with him? If I'm not mistaken, um, stuff that he quotes directly actually involve Matthew, right?
So a lot of what he quotes, here was the question I have to put to you, Brother Fareed. If we assume that Matthew was an eyewitness and he is quoting from Mark and he omits something which is negligible that Mark says, could it be that he is correcting some of the statements which Mark himself wrote by omitting problematic statements that Mark would have included? If that is the case, then that would mean that Matthew is correcting Mark, and therefore Christians can't use Mark. On the other hand, if it is that Matthew is quoting Mark and looks at him as an authority, this seems to contradict one of the sayings in the Gospels. I think it's in John chapter 14, verse 26, where it mentions that the Holy Spirit will remind the disciples of all that Jesus had said and done. What happened to that? Because if you're copying from Mark, what happened to the Holy Spirit reminding you of everything that Jesus had said and done?
Right.
Surely it is. That should not be a problem, but it is.
That's true. I like that. I like your first point. I thought that was quite smart. Um, let's assume the other possibility. Let's assume that Mark is copying from Matthew, because I read that this is a possibility that Mark basically summarized
Mhm.
Matthew, right? The problem with that is what happened to Peter? Wasn't Mark supposedly relying on Peter for his book? What happened there? So
So one of the problems here is that people tend to expand on things rather than to omit them. So
yes,
later writings tend to
yes,
have more words than earlier ones. So in
yes.
this case, that is why one of the proofs that the scholars use is, well, Mark only has 16 chapters. Matthew has 28. So
Yeah.
clearly one person wrote a ton more than the other. So that's one evidence. A second evidence could be that because Matthew removes the Aramaic sayings, it's likely later because the Jews would have become more Greek in their culture and their language, and they would begin not to speak the language that they had done previously following the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So all these considerations, both sociological and textual critical, inform us that it's more likely than less likely that Matthew copied, not borrowed, let me make it clear, copied from the gospel
Yes.
according to Mark.
There's that stuff about Levi, right? Mark is
Yeah.
being okay. So I know this is going to go over the heads of some of our viewers, but is that stuff about Levi in Luke?
Actually put me on the spot. I actually can't remember.
Okay. I was hoping that could help solve the mystery of or that would be definitive proof of who quoted whom. Because if Luke relies on Mark as well. Luke copies from. Can we tell? Does Luke copy from Matthew things that he doesn't copy from Mark?
So I'll tell you this. There are things common to Matthew and Luke, which they get from Mark. And then within the tradition itself, there are things borrowed from Matthew into Luke and things borrowed from Luke into Matthew. We don't know if this was done by the initial composer or if this is what the scribes did as they tried to harmonize the contradictions between the
Mm,
gospels over the centuries.
interesting stuff, man. Barakallah fik. I think that's all the time we have for today. I enjoyed this, bro. Akhi, I'm learning, man. I'm learning the
Me-
stuff, and I remember I was talking to Zakir. Um, I don't know, akhi, maybe it was a year ago or something. I was like, Zakir, is I watched like a video by Colin or something like a year ago, and I didn't know any of this stuff, and I was like, am I going to have to study this stuff? Am I going to have to go in depth? Because it seems like there's something they may seem to have something going for them. um, and the deeper I go into this, the more I realize that it's as flimsy, if not flimsier, than I originally thought it was. So, barakallah fiqh, I'm learning and I appreciate you giving me these private lessons, man. We're going to share it with the world, but thank you, Yahi, first of all.
Thank you for the opportunity, Brother Farid.
Habibi. To the rest of you guys, I don't know when I'm going to see you next. Maybe tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.